Hello, and welcome to the Unsung Cyberhero Adventures TV network. Today's show focuses on answering the question, what is the state of the credit and risk management cybersecurity ecosystem? Stay tuned to find out. I'm your host, Gary Berman. Our mission is to shine the light on the people and organizations who keep us safe online while at work, home, and school, and to serve as a business-to-business networking platform for the cybersecurity and information technology community. We've learned that 55% of human communications is nonverbal. That's why we include a video feed so that you have the option of seeing our guests or simply to just listen. That's also why we're called a TV network. We're all about information sharing and business-to-business networking. You never know who you're going to connect with and how you'll be able to maximize opportunities resulting from hearing from our guests. This is especially valuable right now that the community's primary way of conducting business, conferences, has been put on hold for the foreseeable future. We have a great panel, including Ian Cohen, CEO of Apomaya. Prior to his current role, he was the general manager at Experian Consumer Services Division and chief executive officer of Credit.com from 2009 to 2015. Hey, Ian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gary. Great to be here.
Thank you. Our next guest is Ofer Israeli, founder and CEO of Illusive Networks. He's a pioneer of deception-based cybersecurity. He leads the company at the forefront of the next evolution of cyber defense. Prior to establishing Illusive Networks, Ofer managed development teams based around the globe at Israel's seminal cybersecurity company, Checkpoint Software Technologies, and he was a research assistant in the Atom Chip Lab, focusing on theoretical quantum mechanics. Hey, Ofer, welcome to the show.
Hey, Gary, thanks for having me.
Before we go on, you know I'm going to ask you what theoretical quantum mechanics is, so stand by on that one.
That might provide a long discussion.
I'm sure it will. And finally, we have Andrew Robinson, who's the chairman of Apomaya. Andrew and his team bring visibility to the digital advertising supply chain, empowering online publishers to gain control, improve user experience, and increase revenue. Andrew, so glad that you're here.
Thank you very much, Gary, for having me on the show.
Ian, given your long history in the credit sector, how would you describe the current credit and risk management environment?
In general or specific to cyber? I'll start with in general. I think in general it's going through a metamorphosis because what we judged risk by 20 years ago is changing pretty dramatically, even prior to COVID. So some of the big changes that we've seen over the last 20 years are shifts in home ownership, shifts in car ownership. The basic things that we've traditionally judged consumers on has transitioned away from homes and cars for 50% of the country. So we're seeing a big move to alternative data. You've noticed that some of the more recent FICO scores are including rent reporting, utility reporting, and basically just trying to include more people. And this isn't for goodwill. This is because if you don't include these facets and these criteria, lenders are unable to approve enough goods. So I'd say it's going through a big metamorphosis, I think, but the bigger issue and a good segue into cyber is that I think the bigger movement is from third-party data that's gathered without your permission, which is how this system has always worked. It's been a black box to first-party data connections. Consumers there's a whole revolution going on in both the zeitgeist and with regulations like GDPR, and we can talk about that in a second, but just to answer your question very specifically, I see differences in the scoring models, but the bigger shift I see is that the data collection is moving from happening behind your back to happening with your full knowledge. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is it's the right thing to do. And in a world where your data is ubiquitous and out of your control, it's very important. But also, you get better data when you have a first-party connection to a user. I always joke around, I don't want to call any particular companies out, but I have a little chart I love to show that has me, the actual me on the left with all my personas and marketing criteria. And then I won't say which company on the right that calls me a 65-year-old silver sophisticate, says I love dogs. I don't. I mean, they're nice, but I'm more of a cat person. And it just basically gets me wrong. So I think we're going through, just to summarize my points here, a big transition in how people spend their money and how we judge their risk, and most importantly, how we gather data. And that's what Apomaya is really about. But let me pause there and get Andrew or Ofer's input.
So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've been focused on is really the democratization of data, right? I mean, out there today, data is being utilized in third-party applications, third-party ways. People don't have transparency or visibility to how that data is being used. And I think it's important, just basically from a corporate and enterprise perspective, to make sure you're targeting the right person, but also doing it in a permissioned and an officious way.
No, and let's build on that just for a moment, because Ian, you mentioned GDPR. Either to Andrew or Ian, can you just explain to our audience what GDPR is? And what is the state of this kind of patchwork of legislation, that's kind of sweeping throughout the United States?
I'll take this one. Yeah, so general data and privacy role, and then in California, you have the California Consumer Protection Act. I hope I got the acronyms right, but here's the deal. There has been no, in the US, let's start with the US, GDPR applies to the EU. CCPA applies to just California, but California is a big enough market that if you're in the United States and you are an online business, or frankly, even wanting to ship to California, you abide by CCPA. If you're a large enough company in the US, you also want to abide by GDPR. The problem has been, and I'm sure you know this, Gary, you're probably as much of an expert on state reach rules as anybody. The big problem is every state has its own rule. There is no there's no federal rule on what's PII, the penalties for losing records. So what happens is these big markets like the EU, which is a single trading bloc, or California, end up forming their own rules. And they start off somewhat ad hoc, but the general sense of what's happening here is that in GDPR, if you want to collect a user's data and cookie them and use that to retarget the user, you have to get their permission. You have to be able to show the data you're gathering to the user. You have to give the user a dashboard into their data. And there are a number of other rules, but I think the point to really emphasize is that the user must know what they're giving away. They need to know how that data is being used, and they need to have access to it. California Consumer Protection Act is very, very similar. It was written very quickly, and it's the first step in a longer process, but that's the regulatory environment. Next to the regulatory environment is just a advertising market that's in a bit of shambles right now. It's just, there's too much coming at us all the time, and it's not the targeting that we want. I might be interested in mountain biking. I would love to hear offers and deals about mountain biking, but that's not what I get. I get retargeted on every dumb thing I put into my browser. And some of those things I put into my browser, I think should never be shared. What if I'm on WebMD, looking up a symptom for a relative or something? So I think where this is really going, and I don't want to get off on a tangent here, is that you have this patchwork of laws that are beginning to coalesce around CCPA and GDPR. As that happens, the traditional way that people leave tags on their site and gather all of your data for companies like Admiral or BlueKai, not that there's anything wrong with Admiral or BlueKai, but just this massive data collection that sites are doing, need to get a whole lot better at their data hygiene and have much better visibility, in particular, into the third-party software systems they're using. So for me, yeah.
Let's thank you for that excellent synopsis. I'd like to turn to Ofer now. Ofer, you have a tremendous amount of experience in the financial services sector. And there's the saying, why do criminals, target banks? And, that's where the money is. Maybe you can share with our audience a little bit of your origin story and how you got into the mission that you're working on now regarding cybersecurity in the financial services sector?
Sure, absolutely. So in order to understand how we got into it, I guess it's worth taking kind of a step back. About 5-6 years ago, a group of our folks had identified a massive asymmetrical problem between the defenders and the offenders in cybersecurity. It's pretty much, it's a cliche to say that the defender needs to be right 100% of the time, while the attacker needs to be right only once. But as cliche as it may be, it's so true, right? So what we identified is that nation-state attackers are doing things in an easier and faster manner, and organizations, not only are they not getting better at detecting those threats, but at the same time, they're bombarded by massive amounts of false positives in their SOC, right? And if that's the case, there was a clear gap 5-6 years ago, but more importantly, that gap just continues to grow, right? There's more tools out there. There's additional weaponization and ability to access some of the latest techniques and such, and there's more noise in the SOCs. That gap is just broadening. So with that, we kind of challenged ourselves for a while to ask fundamentally, what is the problem? It's not a nuance. It's not, any given feature, any given specific product, but what's broken with our fundamental approach? And we came to realize that, in our opinion, the reason that this is broken is that most of the security paradigms and solutions out there have been built on a reactive mindset, right? So we basically look at what happened in the past. We model it in all kinds of ways. It used to be signatures. It moved to behaviors, but it's all modeling things that we've seen. And we look for similar things to that today. And when you think about that reactive mindset, that by definition means we're playing catch up, right? The attacker gets the first mover advantage. We need to continue to chase him. And there is just no way we can win this battle if we continue to chase the other side. So we asked ourselves, is there a completely different approach to that? Could we flip that on its head? Could we be in a situation where the attacker would need to react to us instead of us to him? Is there a proactive way to go about it? And what we started with is a world called deception technology, where the idea is that we're able to distort reality and give an attacker a very different picture of the world. No longer seeing reality as it is, but seeing a whole slew of things, some of which are real, some of which are not real, but they all look and feel the same. And if that's the case, now you have an attacker that he now has inherited the false positive problem, essentially, right? He needs to figure out what is right and what is not, which turns out to be a very hard thing. And that means that when an attacker ever does make a misstep and touch something that is deceptive, you can detect that, and you can detect that with very high fidelity. So going back to kind of the SOC problem. As you said, the financial space has always been hit hard and is still being hit hard. Fortunately for the financial space, there's more money. So there's also typically better defenses and broader teams and more experienced teams. So that's all good. But they are confronted with more threat actors, no question. And kind of relating to the previous question in terms of GDPR and many other regulations, they also have the balance and have to weigh the balance of security and what the threat actors are doing versus compliance and how do I meet these 200 criteria from a global worldwide bank, right? Which is a challenge in its own right. So it's a struggle for them, but it's been receptive very strongly and very widely, and has proven to be a good approach.
And just to follow up on my original comment about quantum mechanics, is it fair to assume that much of your system is based on artificial intelligence and machine learning?
So some of our system is based on artificial intelligence, which actually relates to the automation of building out that deceptive world. The way we think about this is that I think this is true of anything security. Easy to consume should be front and center because there's all kinds of really cool technologies and really cool ways to go about things, which are just really, really hard to implement. And that means it never really gets off the ground, right? So we've automated the process of learning the organization and building that deceptive reality autonomously without people doing it on day in, day out. We figure the banks probably have more important things to do than just building deceptions all day long. That's why they bring us in. And we ourselves get excited about building the platform rather than configuring any specific step, and hence we've built the AI portion into that.
Terrific. And Andrew, just to build on something Ian said a little bit earlier about data privacy and confidentiality, you know, how does that fit into your business model?
So, you know, our business model was originally started with the idea of third-party applications are becoming the norm out there in deployment of features and functionality today, right? Very few IT departments create their own functional apps out there. They go out and use cloud-based services. And this has proven to be, you know, a problem from a perspective of ease of implementation is great, but you don't understand what data you're actually giving away with these third-party applications. And so when we started the business, we decided that, first of all, people weren't aware they were actually doing this. And they called this sort of the shadow IT symptom. Is somebody's gone out there and said, ooh, I want that functionality, so therefore I'm going to install this particular app on my iPhone, or in some cases, you know, install a particular app on a website in the form of, you know, a WordPress plugin. They want the functionality of what it does, but don't realize what they're giving away. And in some cases, I think to Ofer's point of view, you know, there's a lot of human nature out there. It's like, ooh, there's this cool little gizmo, I want to go install it and get this functionality. And then they're basically, you know, hurt themselves in doing this. So we started the company with really trying to expose to people what they're actually doing. And it's quite shocking that people don't realize what they're doing. We have a very simple visualization where we show people what they actually have installed on their website. I won't name the company, but we recently had a conversation with a very large major US telecom, showed them a picture of their website. And what was surprising and actually shocked me in the middle of the call was somebody in their, I assume their marketing team, and that's probably a very poor assumption out there from my perspective, had utilized an application that was sharing data with their largest competitor. Wow. And if you look at it from this perspective, it was shocking to this chief product officer. I would say 24 hours later, I got a very nice thank you note that had happened. But you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar corporation who has probably spent hundreds of millions of dollars of security, and that security had been circumvented by human nature. And I think one of the interesting things that, you know, Ofer brings up is, you know, the folks out there today don't have to be as smart as you know, they used to be in the past, right? They can go out there and offer something, and a simple click through, a simple phishing attack can circumvent hundreds of millions of dollars worth of security out there. And obviously, you know, banks, I think, are a prime target out there today.
And, you know, one of the interesting things that you brought up now is really also the supply chain. You know, I recently had the privilege of giving a speech to the Department of Defense and other people in the federal government pertaining to the CMMC, which is a maturity model that is being developed right now and will be a requirement for the 300,000 or so suppliers to the Department of Defense. And it's good for everyone. It's good for a small business and a big business and things like that. Ian, you know, what is your thought about the benefits of protecting the supply chain, or can we? Is it just too complicated?
I think with COVID, we're figuring out if we can or can't. But no, I think we can. I think the first thing, it starts with what Andrew was talking about with visibility. So you're not going to stop, and you're not going to fundamentally change human nature overnight. So the first step in you know, any security chain is to make sure that you've raised awareness. So the first step, can you expose everything that you're actually doing? And so Ofer has a really interesting take of, I don't know if this is the right analogy, but creating like little honeypots all over the place on your site. I think for us, what we're trying to do is expose all of the third-party code that's on your site and monitor it for changes. And I think in that sense, we can protect the supply chain company by company. On a global basis, we're going through so many changes right now. I would be the first to say, I think it's going to be a rough road for the next 5 years.
Yeah,
Gary, I'll actually bring up one point with Ian. I'll actually use him as an example. He obviously is leaving our company. We showed him a visualization of a very large scale bank out there. And then he went to order some checks for his bank account and suddenly realized all of that information about his bank account and checking information was being relayed out to a third party that he didn't know whether he should trust or not. And I'll let Ian answer the question whether he actually ordered the checks or not from that third party.
I did not order those checks. I actually figured out who the third party was, but yeah, that's right. That's right.
Wow, and Ofer, getting back to financial services and the COVID environment, what do you see on the horizon, and how can organizations, what else should they be doing?
Yeah, so the way we see it, there's three major things that are happening right now with COVID. And this remarkable shift to work from home overnight, which honestly, I think all of us, if you would have asked us half a year ago if this would have happened as smoothly, quote unquote, as it happened, I don't think anybody or a very little amount of people would anticipate that so many companies would be able to make that transition so quick. While we've made that quick transition from productivity standpoint, there are definitely security concerns that accompany it, which I believe we're going to see in the next few months in a very harsh manner. So there's really three things there. Number one is we've totally changed the attack surface of the organization, right? If yesterday I'm an attacker and I need to target a user which is spending most of his working hours doing it from the office and is protected behind the perimeter and all of the controls and everything done in the office, that's great. Now this same user is working from home and his kids are using his laptop to go out and download all kinds of games, and he's connected into the other dozen devices that he has at home that who knows how protected they are or likely aren't, and is the router using the default user password as most people do, or has he gone and modified it? So the attack surface has changed drastically, right? And there's a lot more accessibility now for attackers to get in the first place. The second issue is in regards to our ability to detect threats. And if I mentioned earlier that the SOCs of the world are bombarded by false positives and overwhelmed as it is, think about how much that's changed now in this new work from home environment. Everybody has been talking UI, behavioral, and so on over the last few years. Well, if you think about the world of anomaly detection, in order to detect anomalies, you need to have a baseline of what's normal. But can anybody point to anything normal that's happening right now? Every day is a different world, right? And not only has that been in the last few months, but it's going to remain the case for several months and maybe years later. So we're now being bombarded by even more amount of alerts based on inaccurate read of what's actually going on. So in turn, we can detect threats less. And the last bit, which is interesting, is the rise of insider threats. And in any financial crisis, insider threats become a whole lot more abundant. And we saw that clearly, in the 08 days and in any financial crisis, right? For the clear reason, people are under financial stress, people are being laid off and things of that nature. So that obviously incurs some of that malicious activity. But what's interesting about this specific situation is that you get two additional new factors in here, which are, one, the fact that people are working from home and they have now total privacy, but in this respect, in the bad sense. So if I'm contemplating of being an insider and I'm working in the office and I'm in my cubicle, it's kind of scary to steal data when I don't know who's walking behind me and going to view my screen, right? But if I'm locked down in my basement alone and nobody sees me, then psychologically and very practically, it becomes easier to do. And at the same time, as I'm working from home, I'm meeting with my peers less, or, well, maybe over Zoom, but I'm not having the same types of happy hours. I'm not having the same types of social interactions. And naturally, I'm a bit more detached from the company. So again, I don't think this flips people who would never contemplate it to suddenly be insiders, but people which were kind of on the fence, if you will, this could tip them over in the wrong direction. And that's a pretty massive problem in its own right, which we believe is going to hit even harder in the months to come.
Let's just build on that, Ian. You know, what is it? And I think the answer might be obvious, but you know, so you have this line between, let's just call it, you know, good and bad. You know, how do we keep people tipping towards the good?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just first call out. So if you look at all the incidents that happen that either cause breaches or data loss, about half of them are malicious behavior. The other half have nothing to do with malicious behavior, right? It's just you're unaware. Somebody does something like in the old days, loses a laptop or throws out a hard drive. But today there's 100 different things you could do to that nature. So the first thing you really have to do, and I'll answer your question in a second, the first you have to the surface area exposure, you have to be able to monitor and measure that surface area exposure. If you can't do that, because that covers both malicious and non-malicious behavior. Mage cart breaches is a great example. That's malicious behavior externally, where somebody planted a injection inside a piece of JavaScript. But then you have just as many, and I'm Gary, I'd be interested in other guests you've had on the show, that win like the stupidest act of the year award, where if somebody's in their basement, even if they're not malicious, right? There's plenty of things that they can do wrong because they're not experts. And when your surface area increases, so does all the spam coming in, which is how, you know, some of the most costly mistakes these days are ransomware attacks, really simple stuff like email spoofing, and most of all, third-party software intrusions. So how do you change human behavior? I'm not sure. If I could answer the question of how to change human behavior, I'd probably be the president. You know, so I'm not sure I've ever approached a business with fundamentally how do you change people's behavior on a large scale, but on a very direct scale when it comes to the problem we're trying to solve, it's awareness. Like most people want to do good. If the employer is treating them badly, I can't solve for that. None of us can. But if you can raise awareness for a person and give them a sense of control over their own destiny, I think that's, you know, step one. And from there, it can get very technical. But the biggest problem in security today, I'm not sure it's technical. I think it's that the knowledge barrier to entry, as Ofer is saying, is so high. Things are so complicated. It's daunting and frankly embarrassing to have a conversation with another person from the NSA who is just at this cryptography level way beyond what I'm ever going to get. So as Andrew was saying, can we just give you a simple map? Like, let's just first make you aware. Then can we pierce the veil of, you know, JavaScript and all these other things that are invisible and just say, we're going to rewrite all this on the fly and make it visible. So you're clear. This is where your data is going. Every time you know, it's like not sure the right analogy, but, you know, disease transmission. Every time you put a piece of data out there, here's what happens to it. So I just am much more focused on, can you raise awareness and on the first 50% of problems that happen that are based on just not having a basic awareness and a basic set of tools and a basic view to be able to block behaviors.
You know, I can testify to that firsthand because as the victim of a series of APT insider threats, you know a little bit about my story. I lost several $1 million as a result of this. When I wanted to learn about cybersecurity, I bought a book called Cybersecurity for Dummies. You know, those yellow books with the black stripes on them. And I thought, okay, great. So 10 pages into this book, I was lost. So rather than giving up, I found the author. It was the CISO of a big security firm, and I told him that, and he just starts laughing, like almost crying of laughing. So I'm a funny guy, and I'm like laughing with this man, and finally I say, may I ask why you're laughing? And he goes, well, it's not really for beginners. Then why do you call it cybersecurity for dummies? you know, and that's when I realized there had to be a better way to distill this complicated information into something else, and came up, you know, with the Cyberhero Adventures comic series. Andrew, let's talk about that. You know, how do we simplify or distill the information, you know, that Ian just spoke about, so that, you know, the 99.9% of the people in the rest of the world can get their heads around it?
So, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I'll actually go back to Ofer's point. I mean, I do agree the attack services have just increased so much with the COVID environment. But what hasn't happened has been a simple, I would say, education part to everybody within a, you know, consumer or corporate environment, that data is valuable and data is your crown jewels. And we share information, you know, whether it's on Facebook, social media, all the time, and we don't realize what that information is being utilized for. The same analogy works inside an enterprise. And so whilst we can buy millions of dollars of security tools, millions of dollars worth of, you know, firewalls and things like that, education within your workforce to realize that data is valuable has to be the first step. And if you really want to look at, you know, cybersecurity for dummies, the first thing is, what are you trying to protect? And that's your data. And, you know, I look at this and say, whenever we do a click-through agreement and say, yes, accept, right? I would challenge anybody sitting listening to this, if they actually read every single line of that 2,000-word agreement. The answer is usually no. And in all of these agreements, basically, you know, I've read through probably about 20 of them, and, you know, it's a hard job because you fall asleep halfway through half of them, right? And I'm not a lawyer. And when you look through them, they have three things that are common. Me as a third party, I'm going to take best effort to protect your data. If I do take that best effort and it does get compromised, I may tell you whether I've actually lost your data. If I actually lost your data, I'm not accepting any liability for losing your data out there. To me, that's problematic out there. I understand why corporations need to do that to reduce their liability. We're all businessmen, you know, we're out there. But the fact that that's the norm and people accept that as the norm out there, I think is part of the problem. And I think we have to educate people to realize every time you do one of these click-throughs, every time you make an agreement, there needs to be some liability out there that people need to do more than just best practice. And I think that's actually the first step, right? So
that's tremendously useful advice. Ofer, do you want to build upon that?
Yeah, I was just surprised, Andrew, you don't read EULAs for fun, you know, just sit with a nice glass of wine and, you know, rifle through a EULA. No, I totally agree. It's become kind of an absurd situation where, to Andrew's point, companies won't accept liability on the one hand, and I understand why, because back to the point earlier, they're saying, okay, I'm up against these sophisticated threat actors, and who knows if I'll get compromised or not, and how can I really know 100%? But at the same time, if I'm a user of that platform, I can't be in a situation where, okay, you know, we'll roll the dice, and if things turn out bad, nobody takes responsibility, and so be it, right? It's totally absurd. I do think companies have a massive problem in that respect. I think many companies don't quite realize. You know, Andrew made a great point in terms of, we need to start by identifying what is it that we're protecting, right? It needs to be a risk-centric discussion. I think, you know, the boards have done this for years and years, and a variety of different things, right? And go-to-market models, and on any, you know, pick a subject. But in the world of cyber, because it's such a challenging and such a nuanced space, many companies really haven't gone through kind of that process of identifying what really imposes the biggest risk, what are they trying to protect for, who are the threat actors that should that should keep them up at night, and what level of risk are they willing to accept, right? And until we answer those fundamental questions, we're sort of just trying things out. I think it's really important that as companies build out their longer term roadmaps and strategies, that they get accustomed to viewing it in a risk-centric kind of manner. I think lately there's been, or the past few years, there's been some tremendous work that is kind of bridging the gap between the technical aspect and the risk aspect. And for example, MITRE are doing phenomenal work with their MITRE attack framework, which is more technical in nature, but can easily lead up to elevating the discussion somewhat and understanding from the attack kill chain as a security program, what areas I feel like I'm covered well and what areas I feel like there are significant gaps that I need to address. A discussion we're in constantly, just naturally from what we do, is the whole area of lateral movement. You think about companies have been protecting, building their walls around the companies and trying to keep bad stuff out. Over the last 5 years, everybody has realized attackers can get in no matter how high the wall is going to be. And we've moved that to how do I identify them on the box they're on once they land within. Companies are now realizing I can't always identify them when they're on the box. They do have sophisticated ways to go around this. And more companies are realizing, well, if the attacker won't be able to move inside the organization, we've inherently stopped their ability to actually act on their objective. If their objective is to get data, as pointed out earlier, or if their objective is to get to a SCADA system and bring down a power plant, if they can't get there, then effectively there has been no attack. I might have been compromised, but I haven't really been breached. And that gap is one that has been identified over the last few years. And I know that many companies are doing a better job in figuring out how do I cover for this hole.
It's coincidental that you mentioned MITRE because later today we're doing a show entitled Cybersecurity is National Security. And we have the executive director of the federally funded Research Center of Cyber as one of our panelists. So, everyone loves what MITRE does, for sure. Ian, let me just ask you, and this will be a question for all three of you, maybe one at a time. Can you share a real life story of cybercrime, and answer a blinded story if you have to? What happened? What were the consequences? And most importantly, what were the lessons learned for our audience?
Yeah, can I comment first on you asked a question earlier about behaviors, and there was something that Ofer was talking about where incentives are what changes behaviors. And so just to put a bookmark on, we were talking about GDPR, but what happens with GDPR and CCPA is that everybody in the chain of custody becomes liable, and that's kind of what it takes. So if you're going to touch the system and you're gathering the data, whether you use it or not, you're liable. Regarding a real life story, wow. I mean, there's dozens of them. I think the scariest ones that I've seen, somebody actually was hit with a cyber extortion, where somebody pasted a photo of his head into a compromising photo and wanted $15,000, which is coincidentally exactly the amount of money that most personal cyber policies that you buy with your homeowner policy cover. And the thing is, because your data is so ubiquitous out there, you can go to all these data hoarding sites and not only say, hey, I've got these compromising photos of you that I created, but I know your mother, your father, your neighbor, your employer, and I'm going to send it to all of them. And there's really only a couple ways to handle those kinds of attacks or ransomware attacks. You can either negotiate a settlement with a crypto transfer and trust that they'll actually either, in the case of ransomware, unlock your data, or in the case of extortion, honor their agreement. There's no guarantee they're going to do that. But you're really left pretty helpless. What you essentially have to say is, go for it, release it. And in the case of this person, they preemptively reached out to all their friends and said, this is what's going to happen. They were in the middle of applying for a job, and they're an actor, so they were auditioning for a role. It's a very, very embarrassing situation. It could happen to any of us without us doing anything wrong. I can go on to a number of sites, like 110. I'm up to 110 data broker sites that I could go to and basically buy all the information I wanted to about my neighbor. I, of course, didn't do that. But I think those really small prevalent attacks are happening since COVID at an increasing rate. Now, the ones we're super scared of are the ones that Ofer's protecting against. So I'll leave it to him to talk about, hospital going down or a power grid going down. But these these social engineering, extortion attacks and ransomware attacks are pretty damn scary, especially when they're happening to your kid. I did not mention this person was a minor.
Wow, that's just unfortunate, and why we're all here. Ofer, so can you share a story, about a healthcare system that's being attacked? And, the criminals have no moral compass to attack healthcare systems during a pandemic. I mean, are you kidding me?
Yeah, actually, that's unbelievable when you think about some of these people. And yeah, cybercrime leaves you anonymous and such, but you would expect, people, they're still human beings. You'd expect that even if they're criminal, you'd have some sense of morality. And often, we see that that's not the case. And have to say that keeps surprising me time after again, which is really unfortunate. The first story that came up to my mind, there have been all kinds and all sorts, was around an insider thread. This was actually with a global manufacturer. And what was interesting in this case is that this employee, so back to Ian's point, with insider threats, there's the malicious guys, there's the non-malicious guys, which do it accidentally, and we've seen all sorts. The damage is still the damage, but there's very different intentions, and obviously actions in accordance are very different. This specific person was actually a disgruntled employee that had malicious intent. And what happened was that he decided that this was the time he's stealing the data from the organization. And amongst other things, he followed one of our deceptive trails to a network share. And on that network share, there were deceptive customer files and names and so on. And he copied that information over. The person was semi-sophisticated in the sense that he knew what other security solutions were there. As amongst others, he knew there was a data loss prevention agent on his machine. So he took that customer data along with the real intellectual property of that manufacturer, put it inside a PowerPoint presentation, and used his private Gmail account to send it outside of the organization. Wow. Now, I didn't mention earlier, I talked about one aspect of what it is that we do, which is the deceptions. There's another aspect that has to do with forensics. Our forensics capability, amongst other things, grabs screen captures of the machine as bad things are happening. So it turns on when there's an actual alert. So not too fortunately for this guy, but very fortunately for the company, they got to see a video of exactly what he was doing. Wow. And you can imagine that if you're going to have a discussion with an employee that has just stolen intellectual property and deceptive customer data, and he gets to see a video of himself doing it, that provides a very colorful discussion, to say the least.
Well, was he prosecuted criminally?
I don't know. I know he was definitely not in the company from the moment this was detected. I don't know what kind of actions it took afterwards.
Wow, that's a good story. Andrew, what do you think?
So I think from a prior life, probably the most horrifying one that I've seen out there was the CFO of a large Fortune 100 company was delivered a cell phone through his executive assistant that looked like it came from his IT department. Unlike anybody else out there, he thought, oh, great, they've sent me a new iPhone, Android, whatever the version of it was, phone, and said, that's great. Picked it up, obviously looked legitimate because it came from his assistant, logged into it, and then for a period of 6 months, a state actor was pulling off all of the information with his credentials from an app that had been hidden and installed on their phone. And that this company in particular had spent, hundreds of millions of dollars on cyber security defenses out there. But the act of mailing a $400 or $500 iPhone to the CFO overcame most of that. And when you think about how targeted and how intelligent they were to actually say, okay, I can overcome all of that security by just going in there and email and sending somebody a physical device. And it used to be, people used to do this with throwing USB sticks around in parking lots, tech conventions and things like that. But that's probably one of the most, I would say, horrifying ones I saw. Literally for 6 months, these guys got the information from the CFO, knew everything from, public results, everything.
And I mean, just to build on that, as part of our comic series, we created a character called Sonny the Social Engineer, who does what you're saying, and Ivy the Identity Thief, and Wilbur WannaCry for ransomware. And, if this stuff wasn't so serious, it would be unbelievably interesting just to watch and participate in. So on that note, Ian, as we're wrapping up here, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience to amplify, your message?
Don't download apps haphazardly unless you really need them. Be judicious in the apps you're downloading and the third-party services you're using. If you're running a company, that's for individuals. If you're running a company, go look at all your third-party tags. We have a tool that actually helps you expose it all, but just today, go look at them and tell your tech team, if you're not technical yourself, to justify why each one of these third-party tags is on your site, because they could be open wounds that are leaking data. And in terms of all the other horrible stories like cell phones getting mailed out or social engineering, I don't think there's a catch-all solution out there except don't overshare data on the internet. Don't put your most intimate details. I mean, the stuff you hear over and over again, don't share all your details on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok.
Yeah, indeed. Ofer, is there anything else you'd like to amplify that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I would recommend to everybody that's hearing us right now, seeing us right now, to assume compromise all of the time. Let's do the best job we can to keep the bad stuff out. Let's understand that it's not once in a while, maybe sometime will be compromised. No, it's a continuous event. There will always be threat actors in our environment, and we need to be really solid and really good about our ability to continuously detect them, continuously make their life hard inside our environment. That should be our working assumption, and I would think that in its own right gets us to a whole lot better state from a security perspective.
Indeed. Andrew, you'll have the last word.
I think I'll echo both Ian and Ofer's statement. The fact is, assume everything has the potential to be compromised. Assume that, and I hate to do the COVID analogy, but assume everything has the potential to be infected or is infected. So, and protect your data.
Well, just fantastic. Thanks so much, to Ian, Ofer, and Andrew for this incredible interview. To learn more, we'll have their contact information in the show notes. If you would like to be a guest on our show, just send an email to Gary at cyberheroescomics.com. And thanks so much for what all you do, and we hope this helps.